Hello, my name's Tim Shoebridge. Welcome to this video. Now, there is one word that has sprung to mind while I've been researching for this video, and that word is this one. Genius. Honestly, I mean, let's think about some geniuses in the music industry. Geniuses who have created amazing instruments. You know, we've got our favourites, haven't we? We've got Bob Moog, inventor of the Moog modular systems and the Mini Moog Model D. We have got Alan R. Perlman, inventor of the 2500 modular system and the 2600 semi-modular system and the Odyssey. We've got Don Buchla. He came out with his own modular system as well. I mean, you know, these three gentlemen, they are legends, right? We talk about them a lot in casual conversation I see on social media. You know, they really collectively changed the face of music in the 70s and into the 80s, really, before digital technology took over. But let's step back just maybe about 10 years before that time. Let's go back to the 60s, well, even the 50s and the 60s. And into the 70s, because there was another revolution in the music industry, and it was all down to another invention, another musical instrument that was invented at that time. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. Now, who was the man that invented that? Well, we just don't speak his name. His name just doesn't come up. But let me pose a question to you. What was that invention that features in the following list of tracks? And this is just like the top 10 of 1,000 tracks that feature this instrument. What is that instrument? And who is the man that invented it? Now, that list reads like a who's who of famous songs and artists, doesn't it? It's an amazing list, and it just goes on and on and on. Now, the name, Harry Chamberlin. Not many people have heard of his name, right? He's not as famous as Bob Moog and Don Buchla and Alan R. Perlman. And I think that's a real shame, because Harry had an idea. And that idea he turned into an invention and turned that into a product. And that product revolutionized the music industry, starting in the 50s, into the 60s, and keep on going into the 70s, really until synthesizers became mainstream in the music industry. Now, I think it's really important to understand when Harry Chamberlin had this idea, because back then, the technology was very, very basic. The only way that you could record audio was to reel tape, and the only electronic keyboards that existed at the time were organs, you know, these big old organs in wooden cabinets. That was the technology that was available, because Harry had his idea in 1946. That's 75 years ago. That's pretty amazing. You know, his idea was so simple, but a stroke of genius. He had the idea of, what if I record different sounds to different tapes, and then build an instrument where I hold down a key and it plays back the sound on one of those tapes. A separate tape for each key. He created the idea, he had the idea of sampling and of a sampled keyboard. Samples, tuned samples, spread across a keyboard. They could be the sound of an organ, they could be the sound of a violin or a trumpet or someone singing. That was his ingenious idea, and he turned it into his own product. He called it the Chamberlin. It looked very, very similar to an organ, wooden cabinet, but inside of it would be a whole load of tapes playing sounds and a cunning electromechanical mechanism going on there to be able to make this whole thing work. He built these things himself. He kept his business very, very small, and he employed his family to help him out. Now, it seems to me that he wasn't, he was quite a private person, I think. You know, there are very, very few photographs that I can see of this gentleman, and they seem to be like home, you know, family snaps. And there's only one interview that I can find that he ever made. And he didn't have the greatest ambitions as a businessman. He kept his business small. He wasn't interested in sort of like international distribution of it. He wasn't interested in scaling up production of his instrument. He liked to keep it small. He built them himself, and he built them from parts that he'd go off down the road to his local electrical store and buy parts for his instruments. Now, at some point, his Chamberlin instrument, which is what he called it, named after himself, became the Mellotron. And how the Mellotron came about is a story in itself. It really should be the subject of a Hollywood movie. I really do think so. It's quite a bizarre story. It's been told quite a few times, so I apologize, but I'm going to tell it one more time. But what I want to do is kind of keep Harry Chamberlin in the picture, because I think it's really important that we remember the inventor and not just the invention. So here's the next word that sprang to mind as I was doing my research. This one. Deceit. Okay, so I mentioned that Harry liked to keep his business small. He employed his family. He built the instruments himself. Now, he did hire a salesman to help him sell these instruments. And rumour has it that it was actually his window cleaner. I'm not quite sure if that's true or not, but I did read it in a couple of different accounts of this story. Now, that gentleman was called Bill Franson, and he was a salesman for Harry Chamberlin for about a year. And he was basically a travelling salesman. He must have had a van. I mean, these Chamberlin instruments were big and very heavy. And his job was basically to travel across America selling it. And he was selling it to music stores, but also to clubs and bars, because, lots of clubs and bars would have a musician in playing along, like a pianist or whatever. Now, there are no quotes from Bill Franson himself. He hasn't done any interviews and he hasn't given his opinion. So basically, we have to take it all with a bit of a pinch of salt, what happened and why he did what he did. But he was clearly frustrated in his role as a salesman. And I think that there were a couple of issues. The first issue is that because Harry Chamberlin built these instruments himself, he didn't build that many of them. So as a salesman, that clearly can be frustrating if you're selling an instrument, but you actually haven't got the product to actually sell at that time. There must have been a very long waiting list of customers wanting their instruments. So I'm sure that was a source of frustration for Bill Franson. And also, the instrument was very, very delicate. You've got these tapes and tape heads, one for every single key. And if you travel with it and you move the instrument around, there can be all sorts of alignment issues, and I believe that was also a source of frustration. So basically what happened was that Bill Franson just disappeared one day. And now what he did was he took with him at least one, if not two, of the demonstrator Chamberlin instruments with him, and he got on a boat and he sailed to England, a long, long way away from where he was working in America. And now when he got to England, he advertised for an engineering company to help him source reliable, improved components for the Chamberlin. Now, he got involved with a Birmingham-based engineering company, a very small company called Bradtronics, and it was named after the three brothers that ran that company, Leslie, Norman, and Frank. Now, what those three brothers were going to provide were the tape reading heads, matched heads, so that there would be a consistency of sound across the keys when playing back the tapes. But they were so interested in this instrument and obviously showed that they had lots of ideas on how the instrument could be improved in terms of its design, that Bill Franson got them involved. Now, what Bill did, which is the deceit, is he took off the name badges, the Chamberlin name badges, off of those instruments before the Bradley brothers had a look at them, and he pretended that it was his invention. And that is where the deceit comes in. But basically what happened next was that the Bradley brothers got involved, they looked at how the instrument was put together, and they made some improvements. They didn't make so many improvements initially to the internal workings of the instrument, but they certainly improved the production process. They had a lot of ingenuity when it came to production processes, and they were able to produce these instruments at a far greater rate than Harry Chamberlin was ever able to do so. So this is how the Mellotron came about. Now, the word Mellotron was actually Bill Franson's idea. And it wasn't for quite a long time until Harry Chamberlin found out about the existence of the Mellotron that had been developed in England. But that is the next part of the story. So Harry wasn't the most ambitious businessman, but he was a sensible businessman, and he had the common sense to take out numerous patents to protect his invention, his Chamberlin keyboard. And it was because of the existence of these patents that he got wind of the fact that there was a competing product, a Mellotron, developed in England that actually had the exact same technology in it that he had patented. He must have been furious and a sense of betrayal that Bill Franson had basically stolen two of his instruments, gone to England, and then developed a competing product with a different name. It must have been a really, really bad time for Harry Chamberlin, this. But there was agreement that was put into place, a financial agreement, a royalty agreement, a distribution agreement, basically. And Harry was big enough to allow the Mellotron to continue to exist and to continue to be developed going forward. But this is where we come to my word number 3 that sprang to my mind as I was doing this research, this one. Bitterness. Now, Harry did an interview. I think it was a newspaper or a magazine interview. It's the only one that I found any record of. And you can sense the bitterness in this interview. I'm going to show you some excerpts of it and pick out a few quotes so you see what I mean. So I think this is a magazine article, magazine interview. I don't know which magazine it is. It's 2 pages long. It's really quite interesting. It's a very interesting read. I'm just going to pick out a few little quotes from it. On the Mellotron itself, here's the first quote. The Mellotron, it turns out, is the Chamberlin, frozen in an aboriginal stage of development. What an unkind comment that is. Now, this interview took place in 1976, and both the Mellotron and the Chamberlin kept on advancing. You know, they were both being developed independently from one another, and they certainly weren't in an aboriginal state of development by this time. So I think that's a bit of an unfair little statement to make there. Here's a quote on Bill Franson. This is the only quote I can really find of Harry Chamberlin talking about Bill Franson. He says this, in 1965, we had a salesman who sold for us for about a year. And all of a sudden, he took his demonstrator and we never heard from him again. The salesman, posing as the inventor, sold the rights to an English company and disappeared with the money. Again, that's not quite true about this disappearance thing, because there's quite a few photographs in existence of Bill Franson working at Bradtronics in Birmingham on the production line, demonstrating the Mellotron. So he did hang around for a while. Maybe he had disappeared by 1976 by the time that this interview took place. Now, you know, one of the first successful bands to use a Mellotron was the Moody Blues on their infamous song Nights in White Satin. Now, it just happens that a young man by the name of Mike Pinder worked at Bradtronics in Birmingham as a technician for the Bradley brothers working on Mellotron production. He was there for, I think, approximately a year, and he actually left in order to form the Moody Blues and follow his professional career as a musician. Now, about Mike Pinder, this article says this. Pinder was furious when he discovered that he could have bought a far superior Chamberlin for hundreds of dollars less. He corrected things by buying 2. Furious, really? I don't know about that. I mean, if you check out his website, he says an awful lot about the Mellotron. He's written an awful lot about the Mellotron. And it seems to me that he has a huge amount of affection for it. I'm sure he was incredibly surprised to know that there was a Chamberlin in existence, and very surprised to hear about the deceit that had gone on. But furious, I'm not too sure. More on the Mellotron. Here's some more quotes. The Mellotron's flutes are too choppy. The violins cut off, says Harry's son Richard. Ours flow in. That's why the Moody Blues used them. They have cello on one album, and that's ours. It's strong and crisp. You can hear the guy put the bow across it, and you can hear the guy blowing in the flutes as if he's there. Well, to be honest, the quality of the recordings improved an awful lot from those very first initial Mellotron and Chamberlins through to the mid-70s that we're talking about here. The quality of the recordings changed a lot. I've got this little micro Mellotron here, little digital Mellotron. I'll talk about this later on in the video. But what's wonderful about this, one of the wonderful things about this, is it's got 100 of the recordings, and it shows you exactly what model of Chamberlin and Mellotron the recordings are from. So it's very easy to compare the recordings. And I think that Harry's son Richard does have a point. The Chamberlin recordings are far more sort of in your face and real sounding, whereas the Mellotron recordings tend to be, well, mellow. You know, and which one you choose to use really depends on the application, what it is you're trying to achieve with the sounds. I mean, a lot of the sounds that I'm playing throughout this video are actually Mellotron sounds because they are more mellow. They sort of like sit in a mix better than the Chamberlin sounds, but you know, there is variety between them, definitely. One last quote I'm going to read to you from this article here. Mellotrons priced at a perhaps excessive $3,300 US. I don't actually know what the Chamberlins were selling for, but they clearly were cheaper. Are said to be piled up in warehouses, and many outlets have stopped carrying them altogether. Well, there might well be an element of truth in that comment for sure, because, as I said, this interview was done in 1976. Now, 1 year later, 1977, the US company that had the distribution rights to the Mellotron went bust. And they went into liquidation, and they took the Mellotron with them. And that's the next section of the story. So here's an unpleasant word. Liquidation. Unpleasant process. So, as I mentioned, the distribution company in America went bust. It was called Dallas Music Industries, DMI for short. They went bust in 1977, and as part of that whole liquidation process, which is a process of selling off assets to pay off debts, and I think there were a lot of debts, there was a company in the UK, in London actually, called Mellotronics, and I haven't mentioned it so far because it so far hasn't really been important, but Mellotronics was the company that actually marketed the Mellotron in the UK and actually had the rights to the Mellotron name, the trademark. Mellotronics and that trademark was sold to an employee of Dallas Music Industries, well, now an ex-employee of Dallas Music Industries, and that man's name is Bill Eberlein. Now, Bill got hold of Mellotronics and the Mellotronics name. He created a company of his own called Sound Sales, and I think he got into the sort of the servicing business for the Mellotron, providing spare parts, and servicing existing instruments. But that was really the end of the Mellotron. No one was making them anymore. Now, the Bradley brothers back in Birmingham, they were kind of unaffected by this whole liquidation process. They were able to carry on making their instruments, but obviously their whole distribution chain had now disappeared. And they weren't able to call their products Mellotrons anymore, so they called them Novatrons. So you'll see for a short while Novatrons were being made and not Mellotrons in the UK. And basically what ended up happening is that Bill Eberlein and his sound sales company would buy these Novatrons, and he would take the Novatron badge off of them. He would put a Mellotron badge on them and then sell them to American customers at a massive rake up, a 50% increase in the price. It was never going to be a business model that would endure, certainly not with synthesizers now really taking off in the music industry and digital technology and digital samplers literally on the horizon. So it wasn't going to carry on for very longer. It was going to end up being the end of a beautiful era for the Chamberlin and the Mellotron. So, despite the growing popularity and availability of synthesizers and the fact that there was digital sampling technology coming through as well, the Novatron and the Chamberlin did last for a few more years. They kept on producing them. And there was a very good reason for that, and that is that sort of digital technology was really in its infancy. Memory was incredibly expensive, computer memory. And the advantage that the Mellotron had and the Chamberlin had was polyphony. So you had a sample for every single note, and also the fact that those samples could be played for 8 seconds. That's an awful lot of memory that you would need to store those 8-second samples in a digital sampler, and that's why really the Novatron and the Chamberlin kept on being produced for a while longer. But sadly, 1981, I believe it was when the last Chamberlin was produced, and the last Novatron was produced in 1986, which was, by coincidence, the very same year that Harry Chamberlin, bless his heart, passed away. So the legacy of Harry Chamberlin was the Mellotron, which had stratospheric success for a period of time. And when you look at the story of the Mellotron and you look at all those events that took place, every single one of them, it's like a jigsaw. Every single one of them is important to get to the success of the Mellotron. You've got the fact that Bill Franson stole a couple of Chamberlins and went to England and deceived people and said it was his invention. If he hadn't done that, there would be no Mellotron. If the Bradley brothers hadn't got involved and used their ingenuity to create an amazing production process where they could literally mass produce Mellotrons, the Mellotron would not have been so successful. And then you've got the young man Mike Pinder working as a technician at that factory, who then leaves, forms a band that becomes incredibly successful, and then he rubs shoulders with 4 guys in another band called the Beatles, who are incredibly successful, and he gets them interested in the Mellotron, and they go, wow, it's fantastic, and they buy one each. It's like this sort of like unstoppable wave of popularity that the Mellotron ended up having at the perfect time when the music industry in the UK was going through its own revolution, thanks a lot to actually the Beatles. So, the whole story of the Mellotron is a fascinating one. But Harry Chamberlin was at the very start of it. It's his legacy, and he was the genius that invented the technology. So for me, very personally, growing up listening to music when I was a teenager, the music that I was listening to was filled with Mellotron music. It's very nostalgic for me, those sounds. They're very, very, recognizable. Bands like Yes and Genesis that use the Mellotron an awful lot. Tangerine Dream in their early stuff as well. I just love the sound. It's a very distinctive sound. It's full of nostalgia for me, but I love it. But even today, those samples, they're so old now, some of them. They're 50, 60 years old, some of those samples. But they sort of stand side by side with modern sampling technology. They sound really, really fantastic. And for me, when I've had enough of synthesizers and sawtooths and square waves and cables and knobs and sliders, it's actually this little instrument here that I turn to. I switch it on, I hook it up to a huge amount of reverb, I have to say, put my headphones on, and I get lost in these sounds. I love them, I really do. This is a fantastic little instrument. Okay, so what is this little instrument here I'm waving around at you? It's got Mellotron written on it, so it must be official, right? Well, actually, it is made by the company that owns the trademark, the Mellotron trademark. A gentleman by the name of David Keane. I think he went around in the late 80s, early 90s, sort of mopping up after the sort of the devastation with the the downfall of Chamberlin and the Mellotron and the Novatron. He bought up a lot of the tooling that made the Mellotron and spare parts and stock and master tapes as well. So he's been really keeping the Mellotron idea alive. His company's able to service them and provide spare parts for them. He's hooked up with a gentleman by the name of Marcus Resch, and they actually do make a real Mellotron today, a real one with tapes in it if you really want one of those. But they also make these digital instruments. They have remastered those master tapes that they've got hold of. They've got rid of the tuning issues. They've got rid of pops and crackles because a lot of those tapes were very, very old and oxidizing. They've sorted out timing issues and stuff like that. So the sounds that you'll hear on here are really, really nice. They just sort of like fit in a mix. They work well with any music. And, if you really want that Mellotron sound, then buy a real Mellotron. They're still made today. But otherwise, they're here in digital form. This is not the only model that they produce. There are some bigger models going up to one that actually has proper wooden keys like you'd find in an old Mellotron, and it also has poly aftertouch as well, which is something I'm very, very keen to have a play around with. So we've got the digital versions here. This is really creative for me. I love it. I love the fact that you can blend two different sounds together. You've got the whole history here. You can see with every sound that you choose what original instrument it was produced for, whether it was a Chamberlin or Mellotron. So there's lots of history here, and obviously for me personally there's a lot of nostalgia. They're not the only people to make Mellotrons today. A gentleman by the name of John Bradley, who is the son of Les Bradley, one of the founding brothers of Bradtronics, he has started up that engineering company again, and he is making Mellotrons as well. So there's plenty of choice if you want a real Mellotron. Personally, for me, I just don't think I would ever want a real Mellotron. I mean, even a remake of one, a modern remake of one, they are very mechanical things. Tapes do wear out. They're going to require maintenance. They're going to require servicing. I think if I did own one, the first thing I would do is sample it. So I don't need to. I've got all the samples here. This is wonderful. Anyway, that is the end of this video. I really do hope that it was in some way informative or enjoyable. Until the next one, as always, thank you very, very much for watching.
Go down to the lake, take off our clothes, and swim in the cool, still water. For all we know, we are alone, and the world about us is so dark and still, like being in a dream. We have what it takes. Take off our clothes and dive in the cool blue ocean. For all we care, we are alone, and the world about us is so dark and quiet, like being in a dream. fine, be mine. Come on, let's talk straight. You and me go down to the lake, take off our clothes and dive in the cool, still water. For all we care, we are alone, and the world about us is so dark and still, like being in a dream.